and good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be here. Second, before I start, I should caution you that my paper is a very schematic one. I'm trying to deal with what has been an important debate in the Caribbean and in Jamaica, but I'm also aware, thank you, that many of you are not familiar with Jamaican art and Jamaican history, so I've tried to make it an introduction, a very basic one, as well as an exploration of that particular debate. If there is anything the 20th century has taught us in the field of art and cultural criticism, it is that definitions of art and artistic hierarchies are crucially important and highly politicized. According to Eugene Metcalfe, and I quote, "Art represents and sanctifies what is valued in a society. The ability to create and appreciate art implies heightened human sensibility and confers social status and prestige. A people said to be without art, or with a degraded form of it, reputedly show themselves lacking in the qualities that dignify human experience and social interaction. Definitions of art are therefore highly political. They are major battlegrounds on which the struggle for human and social recognition is waged. A people can ill afford to let others control the definitions by which their arts are classified and evaluated," end of quote. Not surprisingly, art in the island of Jamaica, which was a colony from 1494 to 1962, first of Spain and later of England, has evolved in a normative relationship with the culturally dominant metropolitan West. And this relationship has been a conflicted and contentious one. In this context, the artistic definitions and hierarchies of the metropolitan West have served as both an aspirational goal and as a fundamental problem that needed to be challenged. Much of the art that has been produced in post-colonial Jamaica has been ambivalently purged between those two opposites, and this makes Jamaica a good case study. Such ambivalence is a common feature of art from the colonized world, but is pronounced in former exploitation colonies such as Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino population was wiped out by the early 17th century and replaced by new settlers, voluntary and forced. This new population consisted of a dominant minority of white European planters, merchants, and colonial administrators, and a subjugated majority of enslaved and indentured persons, mainly from West and Central Africa, with later minorities also coming from India and China, who provided the labor to support the colonial exploitation of Jamaica's natural resources. Consequently, it seemed that societies such as Jamaica were a cultural tabula rasa that had no indigenous traditions of their own and lacked the cultural autonomy and legitimacy to assert themselves against colonial cultural norms. If you look at the images, particularly the example by Belisario, you will already see that the story is somewhat more complicated than that, and that subversion, parody, and talking back were part of the cultural production from early on. This ambivalence about cultural legitimacy has been a major polemical issue in the intellectual and artistic life of the post-colonial Caribbean, to the point where it has been one of its driving questions. This is perhaps best illustrated by V.S. Naipaul's notorious statement in 1962 in the middle passage that, and I quote, "History is built around achievement and creation, and nothing was created in the West Indies," end of quote. According to Naipaul, Caribbean people are doomed to be mimic men who operate within a borrowed culture. Post-colonial artists and intellectuals have devoted significant energy towards refuting this dismal view of Caribbean culture, mainly by regarding the Caribbean cultural environment as an opportunity for invention and innovation and the articulation of new creolized identities. It is in this context, as part of the nationalist anti-colonial agitation of the 1920s and 30s, that notions about a national, truly Jamaican art were first articulated. The artists who emerged at that time, such as the sculptors Edna Manley and Alvin Marriott, and the painters Albert Huey and David Pottinger, sought to define Jamaicanness by producing affirmative, iconic depictions of scenes from daily life, popular cultural practices, the landscape, and portraits of famous and ordinary Jamaicans. They used a moderately modernist representational artistic language, which it was assumed would convey its content readily to local audiences that were for the most part new to modern art. The nationalist efforts were, however, mired in the very same contradictions they were seeking to address, and their perceptions about art remained highly dependent on Western definitions and hierarchies. They maintained an ambivalent relationship with the popular culture, which was selectively idealized as the main source of legitimate indigenous subject matter, but was granted lower status than their own quote-unquote fine art. The only exceptions were a few self-taught artists whose work could easily be recuperated as fine art, such as John Dunkley, whose brooding visionary landscapes appealed to modernist, surrealist sensibilities. As happened throughout the post-colonial world, this cultural nationalism quickly became the official norm, and it was only a matter of time before its tenets would be challenged. The first major challenge came from the artists who emerged around Jamaican independence in 1962, such as the principals of the Contemporary Jamaican Artists Association, Karl Parboosing, Eugene Hyde, and Barrington Watson, who had studied in Europe and the United States and returned to Jamaica with new ideas about art. High modernism in the case of Parboosing and Hyde, and academic realism in the case of Barrington Watson. Although they continued using Jamaican subject matter, the CJAA artists wanted to be recognized as artists first and as Jamaican artists second, and they adopted an ambitious cosmopolitan outlook which challenged the more insular perspective of the nationalist school. Race also became a major factor in the development of Jamaican art, or a more major factor, I should say, and the younger artists more assertively defined themselves as black artists than their predecessors, and this inherently transnational identification further challenged earlier conceptualizations of the national. A major figure who emerged in this context was Osmond Watson, who was the first mainstream artist to emphatically represent Jamaica's popular culture as black popular culture, and the first to portray Rastafarians frequently and sympathetically. He was also the first mainstream artist to adopt popular culture idioms in his work. Osmond Watson's willingness to challenge the cultural boundaries that separated artists like him from the popular culture, however, set him apart from the CJAA artists, who insisted on the high art status of their work. While the earlier generation had been primarily concerned with developing local art audiences, the CJAA artists also saw themselves as ambassadors of the modern, progressive image independent Jamaica sought to project in the international arena. This resulted in initiatives such as the Face of Jamaica, the first major survey exhibition of Jamaican art, which toured England and Germany in 1963-64. The international response to the CJAA generation was, however, lukewarm, and metropolitan critics focused on the derivative nature of their work. The American promoter of Haitian art, Selden Rodman, for instance, in 1968 berated Hyde's abstractions as, I quote, perfectly indigenous to Madison Avenue, implicitly questioning its legitimacy as Jamaican art. Ironically, the cosmopolitan aspirations of the CJAA artists were thus construed as the embodiment of the mimic man syndrome, at least in terms of how their work was received in the metropolitan West. From such perspectives, authenticity in Jamaican art was not to be found in its responses to high modernism, but in the work of self-taught popular artists such as Malika Capo Reynolds, who was singled out by Rodman as the Jamaican equivalent of the Haitian primitive masters who had already gained international recognition. There were significant local efforts in the late 1960s to grant greater recognition and status to the popular culture on the part of cultural activists such as the politician Edward Seaga, who was instrumental in the recognition of African-derived revival religions, and young radical intellectuals at the University of the West Indies who supported and participated in the emerging Rastafari movement. It is in this context that self-taught, quote-unquote, primitive artists such as Capo, who was a revival leader, and Everell Brown, a religious Rastafarian, first came to the fore. The status of these artists received a significant boost in 1979, when the newly established National Gallery of Jamaica granted them central position in the national art canons and relabeled them as intuitives, which removed some of the stigmas of the primitive. The then chief curator, David Boxer, described the intuitives as follows, and I quote, "These artists paint or sculpt intuitively. They are not guided by fashion. Their vision is pure and sincere, untarnished by art theories and philosophies, principles and movements," end of quote. Boxer thus implied that the intuitives were artists whose legitimacy was beyond question, in contrast with the quote-unquote tarnished mainstream, thus reiterating Rodman's earlier argument. Predictably, this canonization was challenged by Barrington Watson and other stakeholders in the mainstream art world, who saw it as a further threat to their position in the hierarchies of Jamaican art, this time from within Jamaica, and the matter became a major divisive issue in the local art world. While it gave much needed status to the work of some very compelling artists, the concept of intuitive art was based on tenuous notions of cultural purity, which ignored the eclectic, interconnected nature of the popular culture from which it emanated, and also existed in tension with intuitive art's active commoditization as a marketable brand in the local and international art world. It furthermore represented the selective, traditionalist canonization of the popular culture, which reinscribed the very same primitivist interpretations of Jamaican culture it sought to challenge. The debates about the popular culture we have discussed thus far, furthermore, were mainly a concern of the post-colonial middle classes and a few foreign critics, and did not fully consider the social and cultural changes that were taking place at the time. Post-colonial Jamaica's class hierarchies were, however, aggressively challenged by the popular masses in the late 1960s and 70s, in a wave of socio-political unrest which was fueled by migration, urbanization, economic crisis, and global racial and social agitation, and the popular culture evolved rapidly in this context. Its best-known product, reggae music, became the main vehicle of Jamaica's rapidly growing international cultural visibilities in ways which far exceeded the ambitions and reach of the CJAA artists. This new popular culture was unabashedly eclectic, modern, and increasingly transnational, and unconcerned with any narrow conceptions of national culture. Jamaica arguably found its cultural voice in this moment, and its unabashed eclecticism seemed devoid of the anxieties about cultural legitimacy that had plagued mainstream post-colonial culture. Jamaica's new global cultural reach had a strong visual component, namely the visual culture associated with Jamaican popular music, and you are looking at two album covers actually, but owed little to the visual arts in the more conventional sense, and naturally this has been noted by cultural critics. The India-born Jamaica-based critic Annie Paul in 1998, for instance, contrasted the self-confident and expansive creative piracy that characterizes the popular culture with the artistic mainstream's parroting of high modernist values, which he argued was simultaneously hung up on outdated nations of the national and over-concerned with an ever-elusive international breakthrough. While such binary juxtapositions once again fail to do justice to the complexities of Jamaican culture, Paul's argument illustrated how the specter of the mimic man has continued to haunt the Jamaican art world. The question thus arises whether there is a way out of this conundrum, and while the answer requires more nuance than a brief introductory conference paper can provide, it seems obvious that definitions of art and culture hierarchies are crucial to the issue. Osmond Watson was arguably on the right track when he tried to break down the boundaries between high art and the popular in his work. Others have taken this further, in ways that further transcend any reductive binaries. Don Scott's groundbreaking installation, A Cultural Object, for instance, from 1985, subversively introduced the low culture environment of inner city life into the high cultural space of the National Gallery of Jamaica, but in the process also provided a stinging critique of the self-defeating tendencies in the popular culture that helped to perpetuate poverty and marginalization. While it broke all the artistic codes of the time, the installation has also been one of the most popular exhibits at the National Gallery of Jamaica, which suggests that it hit a crucial cultural nerve. Jamaican culture continues to change rapidly, far beyond what the initial attempts at defining it could have anticipated. The advent of cable, the internet, mobile phones, and social media has further inserted Jamaica into the global arena. And while there has been some debate about loss of identity in this context, these developments have also fostered the exchange and articulation of new knowledge and ideas, and this has in itself been a source of cultural empowerment. Contemporary Jamaican culture is increasingly confident, conversant with modern technology, transnationally situated, and is also powerfully transgressive of the conventional cultural and social values of the post-colonial era. Deborah Thomas has called it modern blackness, and you see an example of a dance hall promotional image on screen, and as you can see, it's completely defiant of any conventional notion of good taste that would have prevailed in, for instance, the nationalist art movement. In this new context, the old cultural hierarchies and insecurities may finally become irrelevant. This is certainly suggested in the work of younger contemporary artists, such as Ebony G. Patterson, who is no longer concerned with reactively positioning itself versus the metropolitan mainstream, but speaks with confidence and critical acumen to the issues that arise in Jamaica's new globalized popular culture. Patterson has focused on the contradictory gender dynamics in Jamaican dancehall culture, which contrast strikingly with the strident homophobic rhetoric for which Jamaica has unfortunately become known, and thus complicates the global understanding of Jamaican culture. You see two more examples of her work. As the Canadian critic R.M. Vaughan rightly observed in 2012 when he wrote about a contemporary Jamaican art exhibition, these, and I quote, works reach outward and are made with full confidence in their particular and shared importance in the international art stream. Furthermore, contemporary works represent not one Jamaica, but many Jamaicas. They acknowledge and celebrate the nation's pluralities and thrive because of them. Jamaica, this work proudly heralds, is fast becoming an art world powerhouse, one that looks first to please itself, end of quote. And wanting to please oneself is obviously the first step forward to move beyond the mimic man syndrome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? There we have a question, please.
Yeah, now it works. I thought that was a very good thing that you have introduced the issue of kind of global art practice that travels via internet and mobile phones and other media, because this is something I think that hasn't really been addressed yet, and I think this is quite instrumental of opening up boundaries and de-blacking the holes or whatever, or de-obscuring the black holes and white spaces. Would you agree that this has become quite instrumental for this?
Absolutely, and it really is a way, social media particularly, it is a way to bypass all the gatekeeping forces that exist in the international art world, whether it is the curator or the critic. I mean, the work can travel independently and reaches other audiences as a result, absolutely. It opens up things considerably. Of course, one should not romanticize it, because access to technology is still driven by economic ability. So not everybody has that kind of access, but it is nonetheless very important.
I think also the topic of hybridity is very interesting in this connection, because I think there is such a thing as a younger global popular culture that operates with this very notion of hybridity, and this is not only limited to post-colonial environments, but has become a form of expression, I think, for young art all over the world, actually.
Yes, absolutely, and if you look at the Jamaican art story, it basically is a sort of, it starts with a futile attempt at looking for purity, and it then moves towards embracing hybridity as an essential situation.
Does Jamaica have artist site in the sense that Trinidad has CCA and a number of artists have moved to Trinidad from Europe to live and work? Is there a locus in Jamaica of artists coming back, or we've got Peter Doig and Chris Ofili working in Trinidad?
Well, CCA 7 has actually closed. It closed a couple of years ago when its funding ended, so it has proven not to be sustainable in the Trinidad context. Jamaica has a number of such initiatives. They're not as well known. They do not have the same kind of reach. One is Rock Tower, which is a studio residency facility in downtown Kingston. The other one is NLS, New Local Space. It's all very new at this time, but they're both, and there's some other examples, but both are artist run. Most of the channels for exposure and activity, however, are really government driven, and the National Gallery of Jamaica, other than being a national art museum, also fulfills that role through its exhibitions, which work very actively with the artistic community, particularly the younger artists.
That's what I was going to ask. Can you talk about your role as executive director, the National Gallery, and also the fact that you're not Jamaican, I guess?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm the beggar-in-chief, but that comes with the territory. Well, the National Gallery of Jamaica, it's Jamaica's national art museum. It was established in 1974. It's the largest museum in the Anglophone Caribbean, so it's a fairly large facility. We have about 36,000 square feet of exhibition space. We have a permanent collection which gives an overview of Jamaican art from pre-Columbian or pre-Hispanic to the present day, and then we have a very active exhibition program which focuses primarily on contemporary Jamaican art. We are theoretically funded by the Jamaican government, but in reality that means that the salary of the staff is paid. We have 37 staff members, at least in theory. Not all positions are filled. And they also provide the building and the utilities. Basically all funding for programs, for exhibitions, acquisitions and so on has to be found from other sources, although theoretically that should be there. We find funding from grants, from sponsorship, private sector sponsorship, and also from revenues. I mean, we also exit by the gift shop at the National Gallery of Jamaica. When I talk to colleagues in the United States, for instance, I was talking some years ago to a friend at the Corcoran who was complaining that his budget had been cut by $6 million. I had to laugh because we have never had $6 million to cut our budget right now. Our government subvention is about $500,000 per annum. So we work on a completely different scale. We currently have a very ambitious exhibition of young artists, a very large exhibition, and the overall cost was less than $6,000. So we do a lot with very little in terms of...
And give me a sense of how much you bring in the global, I mean, how you work with the tension between wanting to celebrate the local and bring in the global, and do you do it within, can you separate exhibitions or try to do that within...
Right, well, a couple of years ago, the answer would be we don't have money to do all of that. But what has really changed things significantly is digital art forms and social media, because we can reach out and reach in much more easily as a result of that. We can do international exhibitions or exhibitions that at least focus on the Jamaican diaspora at a fraction of the cost that it would have been 10, 15 years ago when we would have to ship a large volume of art into the country. So this is just beginning at this time, but the new technologies, the new media really make a tremendous difference in that regard. Yeah. But as a national gallery and as a government entity, the gallery is still very much attached to notions of the national, which we're trying to move away from now by at least focusing more on the Jamaican diaspora and insisting that Jamaica is a very open-ended cultural concept, which really has a global reach. So that's sort of our strategy to move beyond the national.
Thank you very much.